They say a near-death experience changes everything, but no one tells you that the unraveling often begins long before the moment your heart stops. It begins in silence when you're still showing up still. Performing, still checking every box of what a strong woman should be, while something invisible inside you quietly slips out of alignment. My name is Elise Monroe. I wasn't anyone special to the world, just a mother, an executive, a woman who had built her entire life around being dependable, composed, capable. I was the vice director of a national healthcare corporation and a single mother of 2 teenagers. I had survived a chaotic, unstable childhood and spent my adulthood chasing control like it was oxygen. From the outside, I seemed successful, but inside something was breaking. I carried years of unspoken tension in my body, headaches that pressed behind my eyes, a jaw that clenched so tightly it radiated into my ears, a heart that beat too fast during meetings and hesitated when I was alone in traffic. I called it stress and powered through. That was my way. That was what survival had taught me. Then one December morning, I woke up and couldn't move my jaw at all. My temple throbbed with a kind of pain that felt like something was trying to force its way out of me. The dentist was concerned. He sent me to a specialist who quickly recommended reconstructive surgery under sedation. I nodded through the instructions, made the appointment, and told no one how afraid I was. I didn't say it out loud, but I was terrified not just of anesthesia, but of surrendering. What if I let go and everything I'd built collapsed? What if I didn't wake up? What if the stillness I secretly longed for swallowed me whole? But I smiled, signed the forms, kissed my kids, and told them I'd be back before dinner. On the day of the procedure, I sat upright in the surgical chair, trying to control my breath while the nurse adjusted the mask. The air smelled like peppermint and sterile gauze. As the gas entered my lungs, everything began to blur at the edges. Voices grew faint. The ceiling above me shimmered, not with light, but with distance. I took one final breath and then I slipped. I didn't fall asleep. I didn't lose consciousness. I left. It was like sliding backward through my own spine and then floating completely detached. I could see my body from above, lifeless beneath the surgical light. But I wasn't afraid. I wasn't confused. I felt more alive than I'd ever felt. Then everything dissolved. The walls, time, sound, it all disappeared. I was surrounded by a presence, not a place. There was no form, no light, no shape. Just consciousness, vast and limitless, and I wasn't in it, I was it. My sense of identity expanded beyond name or role. And then I felt something so ancient and intelligent and overwhelmingly loving that it made my soul ache with recognition. It wasn't a person. It didn't speak. It was a knowing, a field, a warmth so total that it erased all my ideas of what love had ever been. This wasn't death. This was return. Later, I would call it a near-death experience, but that word barely fits. I didn't see a tunnel. I didn't float toward a light. I became light. I became memory and emotion and presence all at once. I felt myself dissolve into something that knew every corner of who I was and held it all without condition. My regrets, my triumphs, my shame, my rage, my exhaustion. It was all allowed, all accepted, all seen. And I saw moments from my life, childhood, snapshots, late-night cries, my daughter's laughter, my son's tiny hand clutching mine. But these weren't memories. They were alive, suspended, sacred. I saw moments I had dismissed or forgotten. I saw pain that had shaped me and joy that had healed me, and I understood that none of it had been wasted. Nothing was random. Even the hardest chapters were threads in a design I had never noticed. In that space, I realized how much of my life I had spent trying to be enough for my job, for my family, for the world. But here, none of that striving mattered. I was already whole, already worthy, nothing to prove, nothing to fix. I didn't need to ask any questions. I already knew the answers. I wasn't separate from anything. I was part of something infinite, and it felt like home. The presence I was held by it wasn't a being. It was the original language, the memory of love before it had shape. And in that awareness, I could feel the connections between all things, every soul, every silence, every galaxy. Not intellectually, vibrationally, I belonged to it. I was it. But then I felt the shift, a pull. It wasn't harsh. It was gentle, like the tide beginning to turn. I didn't want to go. I wasn't ready. I wanted to stay in that vastness, that peace. But then came the message, not in language, but in knowing you have more to do. That was it. Simple, final. My awareness began to condense. The warmth retreated, the sounds returned, the sterile beeping, the clink of metal voices calling my name. I opened my eyes. The lights were blinding, my body ached, my throat burned. A nurse hovered over me, relief pouring from her face as she whispered, "You're okay. You scared us." But I wasn't okay. I was altered. Something had broken open inside me, something I could never unsee or unfeel. The surgery was over, yes, but my real journey had only just begun, because I had touched the eternal. I had been reminded of a truth deeper than breath, and I knew without question that I would never be the same. The world didn't change when I came back. My kitchen still smelled like coffee in the morning. My inbox still overflowed. My children still argued over trivial things and asked what was for dinner like nothing had happened. But inside me, everything was different. It was like returning to a movie set of my own life where all the props and people were in the right place, but the story no longer fit. The lines felt rehearsed. The laughter sounded hollow. I was there, but not the same. Something vast had opened inside me, and it refused to be silenced. In the days that followed the procedure, I did what was expected. I answered calls. I nodded through meetings. I smiled at the nurse's jokes during my follow-up appointment. I played my part well, but at night when the house grew quiet and the performance was over, I would sit at the edge of my bed and place my palms together, not out of prayer, not out of habit, but instinct. There was something inside me now, humming like a second heartbeat, something that remembered what I had touched. My bones ached with it. My breath slowed with it. I couldn't name it. I didn't try to, but it lived in me like a sacred echo that refused to fade. The doctor said it was likely a reaction to the anesthesia, a drop in oxygen, a brief cardiac irregularity. Nothing serious, nothing permanent. But none of their explanations accounted for the awareness I had brought back with me. None of it explained how I could now feel the truth hiding behind people's words, how I could sense grief vibrating beneath polite smiles. It was as if something in my wiring had changed. I was tuned to frequencies others couldn't hear, seeing layers of life that had always been there, just invisible to the ordinary eye. I didn't tell anyone, not at first, not because I was ashamed, but because there were no words that could capture what I had experienced. How do you explain timelessness to people who live by schedules? How do you speak of a love so complete it erased the need for questions in a world addicted to answers? What I had experienced wasn't a memory. It was still happening inside me like an ember that refused to die out. But the ember came with a cost. The roles I had once inhabited, executive, mother, achiever, no longer fit the way they used to. The goals I had chased with such precision now felt meaningless. One morning as I stood in front of the mirror getting ready for work, hair-pinned, blazer-crisp lipstick perfectly drawn, I stared at my reflection and whispered aloud, "Who are you pretending to be?" And in that moment, something cracked wide open. I began to withdraw, not out of sadness but necessity. The noise of the world grated against the stillness that had awakened inside me. Crowds overwhelmed me. Deadlines felt like fiction. I started walking barefoot in my backyard, digging my fingers into the dirt like it was medicine. I sat under trees and listened not for birds, but for something older, something I couldn't name, but had started to recognize as the voice of the soul itself. I wasn't meditating. I wasn't being spiritual. I was surviving. I was adapting to a world that suddenly felt foreign. And in the stillness, I began to hear things, hums, rhythms, silences that spoke louder than words. I would sit in my art room for hours staring at blank canvases, not painting, just listening, waiting, letting the silence shape me into something new. But real life kept tugging at me. My children still needed breakfast. The board still wanted updates. Emails still flooded in, each one carrying the subtle pressure to return to perform, to achieve, to resume the life I had worked so hard to build. I smiled. I complied. But inside, I was already drifting away from that version of me. She felt like a ghost wearing my name. One sleepless night, I opened my laptop and typed near-death experience into the search bar. And suddenly, I wasn't alone. Page after page of stories, strangers from across the world who had touched the same light, felt the same timelessness, carried the same ache. I devoured their words, not as entertainment, as survival. Their stories weren't strange. They were familiar. They mirrored my own in tone, in vibration, in truth. I didn't feel crazy anymore. I felt remembered. With each story, I recalled more, not details, but sensations. The merging, the clarity, the unbearable love, the sense that every experience, good or painful, had a purpose, and that purpose was always, always rooted in love. I remembered what it felt like to be seen without effort, to be held without question, to be whole without condition. And with that remembering came an overwhelming realization I had spent most of my life regretting things I thought were wrong, broken, wasted. My childhood, my divorce, the times I was too exhausted to be the mother I wanted to be. But in the space I had touched, none of it was failure. It was all part of the sculpture. Even the pain had meaning, especially the pain. Still, I couldn't bring myself to tell my children. Not yet. How could I look into their eyes and say I died, and it was the most beautiful thing I've ever known? How could I explain that nothing in this world could truly hurt me anymore? Not because life wasn't hard, but because I'd seen what lies beyond it. So I walked the edge, 1 foot in this world, 1 foot in the divine. It was like breathing underwater, like living in 2 timelines at once. But the longer I stayed in this space, the more I knew I couldn't live like I used to. The life I had built wasn't wrong. It was simply no longer true. And once you've tasted truth, anything less becomes unbearable. I began writing again, not journals or essays, just fragments, sentences that appeared in my mind like whispers pouring through my hands onto paper, words about light, about wholeness, about the strange beauty of being fully seen. I painted abstract forms that looked like galaxies, rivers, and eyes. I cried for no reason, not because I was sad, because I was releasing. My body was catching up to what my soul already knew. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't need to. But I knew one thing with certainty: I could no longer pretend. The veil had lifted. The illusion had cracked. And now every moment I lived was being filtered through the memory of something more real than this world had ever shown me. A memory I could never forget. A memory that felt like home. I tried to return. I really did. I showed up to meetings, nodded in all the right places, wrote polite emails, and reviewed performance reports like the old me would have. But the rhythm of that world no longer reached me. Every conversation felt like an echo, every task like theater. I watched myself perform, lips moving, pen, scribbling, eyes making contact, and yet none of it touched who I had become. People around me kept talking about goals, strategy, projections, but I couldn't hear the content anymore. All I could hear was the ache beneath their voices, the way their words carried fatigue, their smiles carried tension. Something in me had changed. I could see through things. I no longer looked at people and saw titles or roles. I saw fear, longing, loneliness hidden behind their polished sentences. I saw myself in them, the version of me I had just left behind. It wasn't just empathy, it was a knowing, a visceral recognition of what wasn't being said. I could walk into a room and feel the dissonance before anyone spoke. I felt it in my chest, in the tightening of my spine, in the silence between the words. I started avoiding large groups, canceling events, making up excuses to skip board dinners, not out of fear, but because the noise of misalignment hurt. My nervous system couldn't pretend anymore. It recoiled at falseness. It grieved inauthenticity. The only place I could breathe was in nature. Bare trees in winter, still lakes, morning air untouched by human voices. I'd sit beneath the branches of the old sycamore in my backyard and feel the veil thin. That's where I could still hear the echo of that presence. Not in words, not even in thoughts. Just in stillness. Just in the space where I didn't need to be anyone. But the contrast was brutal. The world I lived in rewarded performance, not presence. My coworkers began to notice. You seem distracted. You're not quite yourself lately. Is everything okay? I smiled and assured them I was fine, but inside I was splintering. The mask no longer fit, and I no longer feared being misunderstood. What terrified me now was continuing to betray what I had seen, what I now knew was true. The unraveling wasn't sudden, it was quiet, subtle. I stopped pretending to care about things I no longer believed in. I stopped apologizing for my silence. I let the cracks show. And the cracks, it turned out, were doorways. I cried in a strategic planning session when someone made a cruel joke about burnout. I walked out of a quarterly review because I couldn't tell if the panic in my chest was mine or someone else's. I began writing again, not to make sense, not to publish, but to survive. Page after page of unfiltered thought, fragments, symbols, sentences that made no logical sense but felt true in my bones. I wrote about the soul, about light, about how near death wasn't a single event but a fracture that let eternity bleed into the ordinary. Then one morning I opened my journal and wrote a sentence that changed everything. If my soul came back, it must be for more than maintaining appearances. I stared at the words, my hand trembling. That was it. That was the truth I hadn't been able to admit, not to others, not even to myself. I hadn't been living. I'd been maintaining, managing, projecting competence while burying essence. And the version of me who had touched the infinite had no interest in managing anymore. She wanted to live. The decision didn't arrive like lightning. It came like steady rain, soft, undeniable. I didn't make a big announcement. I didn't draft a manifesto. I simply walked into my boss's office, placed a letter on his desk, and said, I'm choosing a different kind of work now. He looked up confused, waiting for justification. I offered none. Just presence, just clarity. I left the building that afternoon without drama. No applause, no collapse, just reverence, as if I was quietly bearing a former life with love and finality. In the weeks that followed, I didn't try to start anything. No new business plans, no productivity strategies. I simply allowed myself to be. I grieved not only what I had left behind, but all the years I had spent abandoning myself. The grief wasn't heavy. It was clean. It made space. And into that space came something older than ambition, something slow and sacred. People started finding me. Not clients, not patients, just people. A woman navigating the collapse of a marriage, a man lost in the aftermath of loss, an artist unsure whether his pain had meaning. They came to sit across from me, not for answers, but for presence. And I didn't try to fix them. I didn't try to coach or lead or advise. I just listened. I held space the way I had been held. I remembered. And in that remembrance, they began to remember too. Some of them cried within minutes, not because I had said anything profound, but because in my silence, they no longer needed to pretend. I didn't use the phrase near-death experience unless they asked. It wasn't about the label. It was about what that moment had unlocked in me, the capacity to hold someone's truth without shrinking from it, to see a soul underneath a story, to let presence be enough. But even as this new rhythm emerged, I still had moments of aching. I missed the light. I missed the vastness. Some nights I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of smallness, the way this world constricts what the soul knows. I'd feel it in my chest, a fierce, wordless ache. It wasn't depression. It wasn't despair. It was homesickness. And yet even that ache became sacred. I learned to sit with it, to let it rise like tide. I stopped trying to escape it and began to understand it as a compass. It wasn't pulling me backward. It was pulling me inward, reminding me that the experience wasn't meant to be escaped to, but embodied. Not a story to retell, a way to live. There were no grand answers, but there were moments, small, shining fragments. A client whispering, I've never told that to anyone before. My daughter hugging me without a word. A stranger in a grocery store locking eyes with me like they'd seen a glimpse of something they couldn't name. These were the real reasons I was sent back. These were the threads of purpose. Not achievement, not legacy, presence, connection, love without performance. Because that was the truth of my near-death experience. It wasn't an escape. It was a return to the self I had buried beneath titles and timelines, a return to the voice that had always been whispering beneath the noise. And once you hear it, you cannot pretend you didn't. I had remembered, and now remembering had become the only life I could live. Something had changed in the silence. It no longer echoed with absence, it vibrated with presence. I began to listen in ways I never had before. Not just with my ears, but with my skin, my breath, the space between my ribs. The wind in the trees carried messages in forgotten syllables. The pause between footsteps held teachings. Even the quiet between people, their hesitations, their sighs crackled with meaning. I had touched something during my near-death experience that didn't fade when I returned. It lingered like a scent that stays long after the fire is gone. And even though the world rushed around me, I no longer moved at its pace. Not because I was resisting life, but because I had remembered something more real than time. Each morning before the sun rose, I would sit at my window with a cup of tea warming my hands, my breath soft and unforced. I wasn't meditating. I wasn't chasing a spiritual moment. I was remembering what it felt like to exist without striving, to sit without needing to produce, to prove, to become. That was the true gift the experience left me with, not certainty, but surrender. I no longer needed to explain myself. I only needed to stay open enough to listen. And something answered. At first it came in images, spirals, symbols, stars, glimpses of color behind closed eyes, then phrases. They didn't arrive as thoughts. They came from somewhere older than the mind. Sentences would rise up in me, gentle but undeniable. You are being breathed. Trust the space between. Truth doesn't need to shout. I never knew when they would come. But when they did, my body recognized them as real, not ideas, not inspiration, truth. And truth I had come to understand doesn't arrive with noise, it arrives with weight, with stillness. At night, I began dreaming again, but not of stories or symbols. I dreamed in memory. I would wake up with tears on my face and the echo of stars still pulsing behind my eyes. One dream returned again and again. I was standing barefoot in a vast desert, arms open wide, while waves of light passed through me like I was made of fire and wind. There was no fear, only reception, only transmission. I wasn't being shown something, I was becoming it. The dream didn't frighten me, it grounded me. It reminded me that I wasn't making this up, that I wasn't alone. I began keeping a dream journal, not to interpret, not to control, but to honor. It felt like my soul had waited decades for me to finally become quiet enough to hear it speak. Now that I had, it was pouring everything into the silence. One entry simply read, "I am not here to find my purpose. I am here to become it." That sentence haunted me in the best way. It shifted everything. For most of my life, I had been chasing titles, goals, milestones. But now, all of that felt like theater. Beautiful, but staged, controlled, external. What I longed for now was to live lit from the inside, not for applause, for truth. And truth I was learning didn't always look graceful. Sometimes it looked like me weeping on the kitchen floor without a single explanation. Sometimes it looked like saying no to an invitation I once would have accepted out of politeness. Sometimes it looked like lying beneath the stars for hours, hearing nothing but my own heartbeat, echoing something ancient. I didn't share this version of myself with everyone, not because I was hiding it, but because it was sacred. And sacred things don't ask to be understood. They ask to be respected. Still, people noticed. The ones who sat with me in sessions stopped speaking only about problems. They started speaking about their souls. They told me about moments of inexplicable calm in the midst of chaos. They whispered about memories they didn't know anyone else would believe. They'd ask me questions like, "Do you ever feel like this world isn't the whole story?" I wouldn't answer with logic. I'd just nod, smile, hold space. My near-death experience had taught me something few people understand, that presence answers more than words ever can. One afternoon, a woman came to see me. She had lost her child. Her grief walked in ahead of her, thick and untamed. She sat across from me, trembling, silent eyes like broken glass. I didn't speak. I simply moved closer, placed my hand over her heart, and breathed with her. For minutes, maybe hours. Time bent around us, and then she shattered, not violently, but completely. Her sorrow poured out, and I didn't hold her as a therapist. I held her as a mirror, as someone who had touched the same silence, and something passed between us that had no name, no instruction, just remembrance, soul to soul. That evening, as I walked along the riverbank near my home, something inside me whispered, "You are becoming the memory of the light." It wasn't a command, it wasn't encouragement, it was confirmation. I was no longer a witness to the divine, I was becoming a vessel for it. Not in a grand or theatrical way, not in a way that demanded attention, but in the way still water reflects the moon. Yet even with all this unfolding, I still had moments of doubt. I'd question myself. Was it all real? Had I imagined it? Was it trauma dressed up as transcendence? The mind can be so clever, so ruthless in its need to categorize. But every time the doubt would rise, something inside me, quiet, firm, would respond. You didn't imagine the love. You returned with it, and that was my compass. Not certainty, not answers, but love. Love that was not born of this world, but pulsed through it. A love that lived in the breath between words, in the pause between thoughts. A love that had no opposite, no condition. The love that I had become when I left my body. The love that now lived inside my silence, because the voice that had guided me through my near-death experience had not left. It had only changed form. Now it whispered through instincts, through dreams, through the way my chest ached when someone spoke their truth, through the way my breath deepened when someone dropped their mask. The soul I was learning does not speak with volume. It speaks with resonance, and when we finally stop performing, when we stop reaching and soften enough to listen, we realize something it has been singing all along, and now I could finally hear it. There came a moment when the silence inside me could no longer stay hidden. I had been living in two worlds, one seen, one felt, and for a while I could walk the line between them, one foot in structure, one in spirit. But eventually, the river inside me began to flood its banks. The inner world, the one shaped by my near-death experience, no longer wanted to be whispered. It wanted to be lived. It wanted form. It wanted breath. And the cost of denying it was pain, not physical, soul pain. A dull, piercing ache in the center of my chest that would flare every time I said yes when I meant no. Every time I smiled when I wanted silence. Every time I swallowed truth to make others comfortable. I had always thought authenticity was a preference, something nice to have when life allowed. But I see now it's a survival instinct. Once you've stood in the presence of the eternal, pretending becomes unbearable. So I began making small shifts. I stopped watching the news, not because I didn't care, but because the noise no longer matched my frequency. I donated half my wardrobe, especially the clothes I wore to impress. I removed the mirrors from rooms where I used to judge my body. I turned off harsh lights and lit candles instead, not for ritual, but for memory. Each change was quiet, but each was a declaration I will not abandon myself again. One afternoon, I found an old vision board tucked in a drawer. It was from 5 years earlier, a collage of beach houses, luxury handbags, leadership awards, and photos of sleek women with perfect posture and perfect teeth. I stared at it for a long time, not with shame, but with love. That woman had done what she needed to survive. She believed those dreams would make her feel whole, and for a time they did. I took the board outside, tore it into pieces, and fed it to the fire. I whispered thank you as the edges curled and the smoke rose. What surprised me wasn't how much I had changed, but how many others around me were secretly waiting for someone to go first. Friends began reaching out, former colleagues, distant acquaintances, not to talk about business or success, but about the dreams they'd buried, the whispers they'd ignored, the unshakable feeling that they were meant for something more. They didn't need advice. They needed permission. Permission to soften, to listen, to remember. And I realized something powerful. I didn't need to build a brand. I didn't need to launch a new career. I was already the medicine. My story, my presence, my eyes now holding galaxies they didn't understand, that was enough. But still, something inside me knew that the story mattered. Not for validation, not to be seen, but to serve. So I sat down one day, hands trembling over the keyboard, and began to write not a memoir, not a lesson plan, just a remembering. I wrote about the moment I left my body, the weightlessness, the stillness, the intelligence in the void. I wrote not in paragraphs, but in pulses, words that didn't belong to structure. They belonged to soul. I wrote until my hands went numb. Then I shared just a fragment, a short passage. Quiet. No hashtags, no fanfare, just truth. And within hours, messages began to appear. People thanking me, people saying they'd felt the same thing but never had the words. One message simply read, "Reading your words made me cry, not because they were sad, but because they made me remember who I am." That sentence stayed with me. It wrapped around my ribs like a thread, because that's what my near-death experience had done. It had made me remember. And now that remembering was becoming contagious, my life had become a tuning fork realigning others, not through explanation, but through frequency. I began hosting small circles in my home, no agenda, no lectures. Just space. We lit candles, brewed tea, sat in silence until something true rose to the surface. Sometimes people cried. Sometimes no one spoke for 20 minutes. One night, a man in his 60s who'd never spoken publicly about his emotions began recounting the moment his wife took her last breath. He said something left his body too, something he still couldn't name. The room held its breath with him. No one rushed in to explain. No one wrapped it in cliché. We just witnessed. And in that witnessing, healing happened. I had thought healing meant fixing, but now I knew healing is remembering. Remembering that we are not broken, that we are not alone, that we are souls eternal luminous pretending for a while to be human. And my role wasn't to teach that, it was to embody it. Still not everything was beautiful. Some relationships faded, some family members withdrew. Not with malice, but because they couldn't meet me in the depths I now lived from. I didn't blame them, but I mourned them, quietly. I lit candles for them, not to change them, but to let them go with grace. My path wasn't better, just different, and it required sacred solitude. But the solitude was not empty. It was full. It shimmered. It held me in ways company never could. I no longer feared being alone, because in solitude I could hear the voice I met in the light, the same voice that told me, "You have more to do." Now it whispered through instinct, through dreams, through the knowing that rose in the middle of ordinary tasks like washing dishes or folding sheets. One day, while walking beneath a sky streaked with autumn gold, I remembered something I had felt on the other side. Life isn't a test. It's a canvas, a sacred unfolding. There is no right path. There is only the path that makes your soul hum. That hum, I now understood, was God. And so I followed it. Not perfectly, not always confidently, but faithfully. Because once you've died into love, you cannot unknow it. And once you've remembered who you are, pretending becomes impossible. I once believed that touching eternity would change me forever, that the imprint of that sacred stillness would remain etched into my skin like a constellation, a permanent mark of having been kissed by the infinite. I thought that after my near-death experience, the light I had become would walk beside me always radiant and unwavering. But what no one tells you is that memory and presence are not the same, and that the most unexpected ache of all is not the fear of losing what you love, but the sorrow of remembering what you can no longer feel. The dimming didn't come with thunder. It arrived subtly in moments too quiet to notice until they were already gone. At first, it was the silence that changed. The space I used to feel between my thoughts, so full of pulse and presence, began to feel thinner, less vibrant. Then the dreams slowed. The visions became distant echoes instead of songs. The mornings that once began with sacred rhythm now felt mechanical, even forced. I still lit the candle. I still walked barefoot through dew-soaked grass. But the air felt different, less alive, as if the world had quietly rolled itself back into its old form while I wasn't looking. I didn't speak of it. I still held space for others, still listened with reverence. Still remembered how to reflect the light that had changed me. But privately, I felt like I was slipping, like I was falling back into the density of the world and no one could see it happening. It wasn't depression. It wasn't sadness. It was longing, a sacred homesickness. Not for a place, but for a vibration, a state of being I had once merged with completely, and now could only remember like a childhood lullaby I no longer knew how to sing. I began to wonder if this fading was my fault. Had I done something wrong? Had I let the world back in too quickly? Had I forgotten to protect the doorway I'd once opened so fully? There was a kind of shame I didn't expect, the shame of forgetting, of having touched the face of love and still waking up in a world that demanded scheduled small-talk grocery lists. I lay in bed at night with my hand over my chest, whispering to a presence I could no longer hear, asking where it had gone, even though some part of me still believed it had never left. I retraced my steps. I replayed the music. I revisited the riverbank where I used to feel the veil thin. I reopened the journals. I read the old entries like scripture, but everything that once opened me now felt muted, hollow, like a photograph of a fire instead of the flame itself. I felt like a woman who had once lived as light and now wandered through rooms made of shadow, unable to explain what she had lost because she had no language for what had been found in the first place. One evening, long after the dishes were done and the house had fallen into sleep, I stepped onto the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, and stared up at the stars. Once they had spoken to me. Once I could feel their music vibrating in my ribcage. But that night, they felt like strangers, silent and far away. I pressed my palm to my chest and felt only breath. No hum, no warmth, just the rhythm of survival. And then somewhere deep in the marrow of me, a sentence rose not with sound, but with certainty. Even light has seasons. It didn't fix anything. It didn't make the longing go away, but it gave it a shape. And that shape allowed me to rest. In the days that followed, I moved through the world like a ghost of myself. I smiled when necessary. I returned phone calls. I responded to messages. But my center felt quiet, not in the sacred way, but in the hollow way. I had not lost the truth I brought back, but I had lost my ability to feel it in the same way, and that made everything heavier. I had told others that the divine never leaves, that the love is always here, and I still believed that. But what I hadn't known, what I was now learning, is that even the brightest memories dim when we try to carry them in a world not built to hold them. Eventually, I stopped resisting the ache. I let it move through me like water finding its way back to the sea. I let the emptiness sit beside me at breakfast. I let the tears rise during ordinary tasks like folding laundry. I stopped trying to fix it. I stopped asking to feel the light. I just breathed, and in that breath, something shifted. Not loudly, not clearly, but subtly. A quiet understanding settled inside me. This too was part of the journey. This numbness, this forgetting. It wasn't failure, it was integration. I began to see that perhaps the light hadn't left me at all. Perhaps it had simply stepped back so that I could learn to embody it, not as a constant presence I depended on, but as a quiet truth I lived from even when I couldn't feel it. My near-death experience wasn't a souvenir. It wasn't something I was supposed to cling to or recreate. It had been an invitation to walk differently. And now, I was being asked to walk without the crutch of ecstasy, to be faithful to what I could no longer feel, to trust the knowing beneath the noise. So I stopped chasing the feeling, I stopped performing presence. I let myself be messy, incomplete, human. I held space for others without reaching for language. I let the silence be the teacher. I trusted that even when my mouth had no words, my eyes could still carry something sacred. And slowly, I began to feel a new kind of peace. Not the bliss of the void, but the grounded calm of choosing to stay, of choosing to live, not because I feel light, but because I remember it. One night, sitting by the fire with a pen in my hand, I wrote these words without thinking. Even when I forget the light remembers me. I read it over and over, and with each repetition, I felt the ache in my chest soften, not disappear, but soften. Not because the light had returned, but because I finally understood it had never left. It had simply gone quiet so I could learn how to become it. That understanding didn't arrive in fire. It arrived in silence, in breath, in being willing to stand in the dark and trust that something holy was still breathing through me. That maybe the greatest devotion is not to stay awake in the light, but to walk through the forgetting with tenderness. To carry the memory of eternity into the noise of this world and still choose love even when it feels like nothing is listening. Because in the end, remembrance isn't just about what you've seen. It's about how you live when the vision fades, and I was learning slowly to live like the light had never left. Because maybe it never had. There was no single moment when I decided to change my life. No thunderclap, no grand declaration. Just a soft and steady clarity that began to rise inside me like dawn through an old curtain. It didn't demand attention. It didn't beg for applause. It simply said, "You cannot unknow what you've seen. You cannot live as though the veil is still closed." And so I began, not with ceremony, but with small, quiet shifts. I stopped apologizing for my slowness. I stopped dressing up my sensitivity as weakness. I stopped pretending I didn't see what I saw now in everyone. The ache behind the smiles, the fatigue behind the drive, the hunger for something no one had ever taught us how to name. I no longer wanted to fit in. I wanted to bless. Not by preaching or performing, but by being fully myself, soft when I used to armor up, honest when I used to smile through it, grounded when the world demanded performance. I began to approach the ordinary like it was sacred. Every morning before getting out of bed, I would place my hand on the floor and whisper thank you. Not for what the day would bring, but simply for still being here. I would light a candle not to summon something holy, but to remember that the holiness was already in me. I cooked, slowly touched each ingredient like it had memory. I cleaned not to control, but to clear. I walked barefoot whenever I could not for ritual, but because I wanted the earth to remember me. I wanted to remember her. These weren't spiritual performances, they were choices, quiet, reverent choices to live from the presence I had once dissolved into. The more I honored that inner rhythm, the more it anchored me and the more others began to notice, not with curiosity, but with recognition. People started showing up in my life with different kinds of conversations. They didn't ask about my career or what I had planned next. They asked about death, about the soul, about why they were crying at random moments or dreaming of loved ones they'd lost long ago. A young man in a bookstore stopped me to say, "I don't know why I'm telling you this, but I had a near-death experience last year. I've never spoken about it to anyone." A mother at school whispered, embarrassed, "My son says he still talks to my father. He passed before my son was born. I used to think he was imagining things, but now, I'm not so sure." I didn't give them answers. I didn't try to explain anything. I just held space, offered a nod, a soft gaze, a quiet living reminder that they weren't alone and they weren't broken. They were remembering, and sometimes all we need to remember is a presence that doesn't rush to fix what was never broken to begin with. Eventually, I began gathering women in my living room, not to teach, just to sit. We would light candles, drink tea, and ask one question. What is your soul trying to say that your mind keeps silencing? The answers never came quickly. At first, the air would feel thick with resistance, but slowly, gently, something would soften. A sentence would emerge, a tear, a buried truth. I heard stories that had never been spoken aloud. Abortions grieved in secret, marriages that felt like cages, childhood wounds dressed up as ambition. None of it shocked me. All of it felt familiar. Not because I had lived those exact stories, but because I had touched the place they came from, that deep, wordless longing to be seen without conditions. I didn't offer guidance. I offered witness. And in that witnessing, something sacred happened. I saw it in the way shoulders dropped, in the way voices shook and then steadied, in the way someone who thought they were shattered slowly remembered their shape. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fast. It was holy. But even holy work is messy. I still forgot. I still snapped at my children when I was tired. I still doubted myself. Still woke up some days wondering if all of this was real, or if I had made it up out of some desperate need to believe there was more. But I no longer judged myself for those moments. I saw them as part of the path. My path was not to escape humanity, it was to inhabit it more fully, more lovingly, more honestly. And that meant grace. Not the kind you earn, but the kind you allow. At the end of one particularly tender circle, after the last woman had slipped her shoes on and stepped back into the world, I sat alone on the floor with a single candle still flickering in the corner. I closed my eyes and whispered aloud, "This is the life I was sent back for. Not a life of performance or prestige, a life of presence, a life that remembers the sacred in the ordinary, a life where every breath is an invitation and every moment is a threshold." Because my near-death experience had taught me something I would never unlearn. The veil between here and there is not torn only in moments of crisis. It thins every time we love without agenda. It lifts every time we forgive without needing apology. It opens in moments of awe, of silence, of truth. And when we're paying attention, we don't have to die to touch the eternal. We can live from it now. I stopped trying to change the world. I started learning how to love it better, how to hold it with gentler hands, how to show up without armor and still feel safe, how to bless strangers with nothing but eye contact and a quiet inner voice saying, "I see you." And in that shift, the world changed around me, not with noise or spectacle, but with warmth. Quiet revolutions, one breath at a time, because light doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs a vessel. And somehow through all the breaking, all the burning, all the forgetting, I had become one. I had always believed that once you've touched the divine, the feeling stays with you, that the light, once it fills your chest, never leaves, that the love, the unshakable knowing I had dissolved into during my near-death experience, would continue to carry me like a river without end. But I was wrong, not because the light is unfaithful, but because I am human. And being human, I now understand, means learning to live with the rhythm of remembering and forgetting. The dimming came slowly, like dusk slipping through my windows. First, it was the stillness that grew faint. The sacred quiet that once vibrated through every cell of my body began to thin. Then the dreams faded, the ones that used to leave me breathless in the morning with messages wrapped in starlight. The synchronicities that once flowed like breadcrumbs from the soul stopped showing up with the same clarity. I still lit the candle. I still walked the earth with reverence. But the inner hum, the sacred music I had followed for so long, became distant, barely audible. At first, I didn't panic. I thought it was just a shift, a deepening, a momentary pause in the current. But days turned into weeks, and the silence inside me began to feel less like presence and more like absence. And that's when it arrived, quiet and sharp, the feeling I didn't expect: shame. How could I have stood in the presence of the infinite and still forget how to feel it? How could I have returned from such holy fire, only to walk through the world cold again? I didn't tell anyone. To others, I still looked like I was glowing, still grounding circles, still holding space with care, still speaking truth. But inside, I felt like I was slipping through something I couldn't name. I would lie awake at night, one hand on my chest, whispering to a presence I could no longer feel. "Where did you go?" I'd ask, not with anger, but with desperation. And though some small voice deep inside kept insisting the light hadn't gone anywhere, I couldn't feel it. I tried everything I had learned. I revisited sacred places, played the old music, read my old journals, sat by the same tree that once opened the sky, but it all felt like I was chasing a ghost. I was no longer holding the light. I was holding the memory of it, and that hurt more than anything. Because now I knew what I was missing. I had known the warmth of the eternal, and now everything around me felt dim and thin by comparison. One evening, I walked outside wrapped in a blanket, the stars overhead sharp and cold. They used to speak to me. Now they stared back in silence. I pressed my hand to my heart and felt nothing but breath, shallow, automatic. No hum, no signal, just a body moving forward. I whispered, "Please," though I didn't know what I was asking for anymore. And then, like a whisper through dry leaves, a sentence arrived, not in sound, but in presence. Even light has seasons. It wasn't comfort, it wasn't clarity, but it stayed. I began to understand that I wasn't broken. I was between what had been opened and what I now had to live without proof, between the soaring and the staying, between revelation and embodiment. And this space, this fall between worlds, was its own sacred fire. Because here there were no shortcuts. Here I couldn't depend on feelings. I had to depend on trust. I stopped pretending. I let the ache be seen. I wept while washing dishes. I sat down in the middle of the hallway one afternoon and cried with no explanation. Not because something had happened, but because I was grieving something I couldn't name. Not a person, not a place, but a vibration. A belonging I had known and could no longer hold. And slowly, I began to see the wisdom in the silence. The light hadn't vanished. It had stepped back so I could learn how to become it. It had stopped carrying me so I could grow strong enough to walk with it inside me, not as a flame I clung to, but as a fire I lived from. I stopped trying to feel spiritual. I started choosing truth. I let myself be uncertain. I let myself be quiet in conversations I once led. I sat with my clients and said less. I trusted the silence more than the words. I no longer needed to say the perfect thing. I needed only to be real. And something in that honesty began to change me. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way roots grow under the surface, in the way winter teaches the seed to trust the soil, even when there is no sign of spring. One night, I sat alone by the fire, an open journal in my lap, pen hovering over the page, and without thinking, I wrote, "Even when I forget the light remembers me." I stared at the words, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something stir, not a surge, not a vision, just warmth, just a flicker. And I knew it was enough, Because what I was learning now wasn't about ecstasy, it was about devotion. The light I had touched wasn't just a moment to hold, it was a life to live. And that life I was coming to understand would not always feel miraculous. Sometimes it would feel mundane, sometimes it would feel lonely. But that didn't make it less holy, it made it more human. And perhaps that's the point. To carry what cannot be spoken, to remember what cannot always be felt, to walk through silence with reverence, knowing the divine doesn't disappear when it goes quiet. It teaches you how to hear differently. It teaches you how to become it. The turning point didn't arrive like a sunrise. There was no great revelation, no cosmic jolt that returned me to the light. What came instead was subtle, quiet, and maybe that's how the soul heals, not through fireworks, but through the slow stitching of presence back into the ordinary. I stopped chasing the feeling I once had. I stopped measuring my spirituality by how radiant I felt. I began to notice something else, something softer, a kind of presence that didn't demand recognition. It didn't surge through me like before. It hummed beneath my actions, beneath my breath. When I stirred my tea in the morning and felt a stillness settle in my spine. When I sat next to my daughter while she watched a movie and felt her head lean against me and something in my chest opened wordlessly. That was the light. Not dramatic, not loud, but deeply real. The more I surrendered to the subtle, the more I realized that the sacred had never left. It had simply changed its form. It no longer needed to overwhelm me to be noticed. It asked me to become aware enough to receive it hidden in the spaces most people walk past. I no longer spoke much about my near-death experience, not because it lost meaning, but because my life had become its continuation. The experience had etched itself into the way I moved, the way I listened, the way I paid attention to the things others overlooked. My presence carried the story now not in words, but in energy. I didn't need to prove it happened. I had become it. Strangers still opened up to me in grocery lines. People still cried in my sessions often without knowing why. But I didn't try to guide them anymore. I simply witnessed them, held space without judgment, without agenda. And in that stillness, people found their own truth. That I had come to believe was the real miracle, not seeing visions or hearing divine voices, but helping another human remember their own soul, just by being with them fully. One morning, I gathered all the journals I had written since the experience. I sat cross-legged on the floor and began reading, not to relive anything, but to see how far I had come. The handwriting at the beginning was wide-eyed, bursting with awe. The entries overflowed with longing, with revelation, with the ache of being cracked open. But as I moved forward through the pages, something shifted. The tone softened. The lines grew deeper, fewer. What began as remembering had become integration. I no longer feared forgetting. The light I carried was not something I had to grip tightly. It was something I now trusted to move through me as needed. And even when it dimmed, I understood it had not left. It had simply invited me into a quieter kind of knowing. I began to understand that the work of the awakened is not to be extraordinary every day. It's to remain present in the most ordinary things, to bring reverence into the moments we used to rush past, to look into the eyes of a stranger and say silently, "I remember you." That I realized is what the light had been trying to teach me all along. My sessions changed too. I said less. I asked fewer questions. I trusted the silence more. I created space where people could hear themselves perhaps for the first time. And in that silence, truth would rise. Not because I gave it to them, but because I stopped getting in the way. I learned that healing rarely comes from answers. It comes from permission. Permission to feel, to fall apart, to remember. One evening after holding space for several people, I sat in silence staring at the flicker of a single candle. I realized something had shifted permanently inside me. Not enlightenment, not perfection, but a sense of belonging, not to a place, not to a belief, but to life itself. My near-death experience had not taken me away from life, it had brought me deeper into it. It had turned the veil between worlds into something so thin I could now live in both. I could feel the hum of the divine in silence, in grief, in dishes and dust and breath. I could sense the sacred hiding inside imperfection. That night, I dreamt of a long bridge stretching between two worlds. I stood barefoot in the middle, wind blowing through my hair. One side of the bridge glowed golden, the light I had once touched, The other side was the dense, messy, beautiful weight of earthly living. I didn't feel pulled toward either. I felt rooted where I stood. I was no longer the traveler. I was the bridge. When I woke, the words rang through me. Be the threshold, not the escape. And I understood. I began writing again, not to teach, not to impress, but to honor what it meant to live in between. I wrote about folding laundry while remembering eternity, about grocery shopping with tears in my throat, about brushing my teeth while grieving a heaven I couldn't touch. And people responded not to my wisdom, but to my honesty. They didn't want teachings. They wanted truth. They wanted remembrance. And I gave it not as a guide, but as a companion, walking beside them through the fog. Still, I lived quietly. No stage, no spotlight, just light through kitchen windows, just breath, just stillness, just sacred presence. I didn't see myself as someone who survived death anymore. I saw myself as someone who finally learned how to live. This experience was not my identity. It was my origin point. And from that origin, I had built a life that felt spacious, tender, and real. A life that allowed the light to move freely without needing to announce itself. I didn't need people to believe me. I needed only to remember what the light had taught me, and to live that memory in ways no sermon ever could. And sometimes that looked like eye contact with a tired cashier. Sometimes it looked like forgiving before I was asked. Sometimes it looked like sitting on the edge of my son's bed long after he'd fallen asleep, whispering blessings he would never hear. That was the light, and I had become its vessel, not through perfection, but through presence. I don't live by dates anymore. I live by presence, by how much of myself I can bring into each moment without needing it to be more or less than what it is. I don't rush to label days as good or bad, successful or wasted. I ask myself only one thing. Was I here for it? Did I let life move through me without armoring myself against it? Since my near-death experience, the world hasn't become easier, but it has become holier, even in its mess. Even in its confusion. There is a rhythm underneath everything now, and though I don't always hear it clearly, I trust it's still playing. I trust the silence between notes. I trust the ache, too. The longing I sometimes feel when I watch leaves tremble in sunlight, or when I hear a stranger's voice crack mid-sentence. The ache reminds me that I've been somewhere else, that I've touched something eternal, that this world, for all its beauty, will never quite fit that shape. And that's okay. I've stopped asking for the light to return in thunder or fire. I've stopped demanding it make itself loud and clear, because now I know the light never left. It just changed form. Sometimes it rises in my daughter's laughter when she forgets herself. Sometimes it hums in my spine when I hold space for someone telling their truth for the very first time. Sometimes it flickers when I stir soup at sunset, or when I press my palm against a tree and feel a pulse older than memory. This now is my devotion, not a practice I perform, but a presence I return to again and again. I used to think devotion meant discipline, rituals, perfection. Now I know better. Devotion is how I respond to the ordinary, with reverence, with breath, with tenderness. When I light a candle in the dark, I'm not invoking anything outside myself. I'm remembering that the flame has always been inside. When I place both hands over my chest in the morning, I'm not begging for answers. I'm anchoring into the one truth I can always return to. I am here, still. And that in itself is sacred. There is no final arrival, no ultimate spiritual trophy. Just deeper and deeper surrender to the unfolding, just becoming more real, more quiet, more whole. I've let go of the pressure to inspire or impress. Now I just want to love, not in a poetic way, in a tangible, embodied, everyday way. I want to love through silence, through eye contact, through the way I make someone feel safe without saying a word. I want to love through how I forgive before I'm asked, through how I show up even when I'm trembling, through how I honor the invisible. This is what my near-death experience gave me, not a reason to escape life, but a reason to live it better. Not louder, not faster, but fuller and truer. I don't need to convince anyone of what I saw. That part doesn't matter anymore. What matters is how I show up because of it. What matters is how I walk, how I listen, how I soften. Sometimes I still forget. I get caught in the noise, I snap at my kids, I lose patience with myself. But the difference now is I remember to return, to pause, to breathe, and each time I do, the memory rises again, not as a flash of light or a vision of heaven, but as a quiet warmth in my belly, a sacred knowing that whispers you are not lost, you are becoming. One night, as I stood outside beneath the stars, I whispered a sentence into the sky without expecting a reply. I'm not afraid of death anymore. I'm not even afraid of forgetting, because now I know. Love remembers for me. And in the silence that followed, I felt it not as a voice, not as a vision, but as presence. Pure and unshakable. I knew in my bones that I didn't belong to that moment I died. I belonged to what it awakened in me, and what it awakened was love. In motion, on earth, through me.
That was the near-death experience of Elise Monroe, a woman who didn't just return from death, but remembered how to live. Her journey reminds us that the light we seek is not somewhere out there. It's within us, in our presence, in our silence, in the way we soften when the world hardens. Elise didn't come back to preach. She came back to become. And in doing so, she became a mirror, a quiet, glowing invitation for all of us to remember what we've forgotten. If this story stirred something in you, if it brought you home to a part of yourself you'd lost, then take a moment now. Don't just scroll away. Let that feeling settle. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who's aching for something they can't name, share this with them. You never know how deeply it might reach. And if these kinds of stories awaken something sacred in you, something timeless, then I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and walk this path with us. This isn't just content, it's remembrance, it's devotion. And if you've made it this far, maybe your soul has been waiting for this moment too. Because the light never truly leaves us. We are the ones who learn how to carry it.